Carl Howard's eyes snap open, his vision blurring as he finds himself naked and strapped to a cold metal table. The sterile, alien facility surrounding him confirms his worst fear. He's trapped in a breeding factory, destined to be milked multiple times daily. Panic surges through his body as he struggles against the unyielding restraints. The room, filled with unfamiliar biomechanical equipment, hums with an eerie energy. Carl's heart races, his breath coming in short gasps as he tries to make sense of his situation. The whoosh of an automatic door draws his attention. A group of tall, slender beings with blue skin and large, almond-shaped eyes enters the room. The Rizians, an advanced extraterrestrial species, move with otherworldly grace as they approach the table. A female Rizian, her features delicate yet alien, steps forward. "I am Gia," she announces, her voice melodious but devoid of warmth. "You have been chosen, Carl Howard, for our breeding program due to your superior genetic traits." Carl's mind reels as Gia explains the dire situation facing humanity. A mysterious genetic defect threatens human extinction, and the Rizians claim their breeding factories are the only hope for salvation. The words wash over Carl, each revelation more horrifying than the last. "You will be milked for your genetic material 5 times daily," Gia states matter-of-factly. "This process is essential for creating hybrid offspring that will ensure the continuation of your species." Carl's protests fall on deaf ears as Gia activates the milking machinery. The 28-year-old human male grits his teeth, his body betraying him as the process begins. Pain intertwines with unwanted pleasure, leaving Carl feeling violated and more determined than ever to escape. As the first session ends, Carl's keen ears pick up a conversation between 2 Rizian technicians. They speak in hushed tones about a resistance movement among human captives in other parts of the facility. A spark of hope ignites in Carl's chest. Exhaustion weighs heavily on him, but Carl forces himself to stay alert. He carefully observes the Rizians' movements, noting their routines and scanning his surroundings for potential weaknesses in their security measures. Every detail, no matter how small, could be the key to his freedom. As Gia prepares to leave the room, Carl catches her eye. For a brief moment, he sees a flicker of something in her alien gaze. Sympathy, perhaps? The look lingers, hinting at a complexity in Gia that Carl hadn't initially perceived. Could she be a potential ally in this nightmarish captivity? With the next milking session looming, Carl knows time is of the essence. He must find a way out, not just for himself, but for all the humans trapped in this twisted breeding program. As the door closes behind Gia, Carl Howard, naked and alone on the cold metal table, begins to formulate his daring escape plan. As the door closed behind Gia, Carl's mind raced with possibilities. His body ached from the invasive milking procedure, but he forced himself to focus on his surroundings. Every detail, no matter how small, could be the key to his freedom. Hours passed as Carl meticulously observed the Rizian facility's routines. He noticed the subtle hum of machinery, the rhythmic footsteps of guards patrolling the corridors, and most importantly, the slight gap in the doorway during shift changes. When the next milking session concluded, Carl feigned exhaustion, allowing his body to go limp on the cold metal table. As the Rizian technicians prepared to leave, he discreetly palmed a loose piece of medical equipment, concealing it beneath his body. The moment the room fell silent, Carl sprang into action. With nimble fingers, he worked the makeshift tool into the restraints, feeling each mechanism give way. His heart pounded as he carefully slid off the table, bare feet touching the sterile floor. Carl crept towards the door, every muscle tense as he listened for approaching footsteps. The corridor beyond was eerily quiet. Taking a deep breath, he slipped through the gap and found himself in a long, sterile hallway lined with identical chambers. The enormity of the facility struck Carl as he cautiously made his way down the corridor. Muffled sounds of distress emanated from behind closed doors, each one potentially housing another captive human. Carl's willpower strengthened with each step. As he rounded a corner, Carl nearly collided with a group of humans in various states of undress, clearly fellow escapees. Among them was a woman with fierce tenacity in her eyes, who quickly introduced herself as Dr. Emily Robinson. "I'm a geneticist," she whispered urgently. I was investigating the defect when they took me. We need to find a way out of here and expose what's really going on." Carl nodded, his own desire for freedom amplified by the presence of others. Together, they moved through the facility, their group growing as they freed more prisoners. They communicated in hushed tones, sharing what little information they had about the layout of the complex. Navigating the maze-like corridors proved challenging, but fortune smiled upon them when they stumbled across an unattended security station. Dr. Robinson's expertise came in handy as she quickly accessed the system, procuring access cards for the group. Armed with the stolen cards, they made swift progress through the facility, bypassing security checkpoints with breathless expectation. The constant threat of discovery hung over them, spurring them forward. Their luck seemed to run out as they rounded a corner and came face to face with a patrol of Rizian guards. Time seemed to slow as both groups froze in momentary shock. Then chaos erupted. Carl reacted instinctively, tackling the nearest guard while his fellow escapees engaged the others. The element of surprise worked in their favor, and they managed to overpower the patrol, acquiring their weapons in the process. Heart racing from the encounter, Carl led the group onward. As they passed a room filled with sophisticated equipment, Dr. Robinson gasped. "This is a research lab," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with realization. "If we can access their data, we might find out what's really going on with this breeding program." Without hesitation, they entered the lab. Dr. Robinson's fingers flew across the alien keyboard as she navigated the Rizian computer systems. The others stood guard, weapons at the ready. "My God," Dr. Robinson breathed, her face pale in the glow of the screen. "The genetic defect, it's not natural. The Rizians engineered it themselves. This whole program is a sham." Before Carl could process this revelation, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder by the second. Panic threatened to overtake the group, but Carl's mind raced for a solution. His eyes landed on a control panel near the door, labeled in an alien script. "Dr. Robinson," he called out urgently, "can you make sense of these controls? We need to buy some time." The geneticist rushed over, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar symbols. With a determined nod, she began manipulating the controls. Suddenly, heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing off their section of the facility. Relief washed over the group, but it was short-lived. Through the small window in the blast door, Carl locked eyes with a familiar face. Gia stood at the head of a team of Rizian security forces, her expression a mixture of surprise and something Carl couldn't quite identify. As the Rizians worked to override the lockdown, Carl made a split-second decision. He activated the lab's communication system, opening a channel to Gia. "Gia," he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, "we've uncovered the truth about your breeding program. The genetic defect affecting humans. Your people created it." Carl watched as shock registered on Gia's face. He pressed on, sharing Dr. Robinson's findings and appealing to the sympathy he had glimpsed in Gia earlier. "This isn't right, Gia. Your people are subjugating an entire species based on a lie. Help us expose the truth." As Carl spoke, he could see the conflict in Gia's eyes. The Rizian hesitated, her hand hovering over the override controls. Behind her, the security team grew restless, urging her to act. Inside the lab, tension mounted as the humans prepared for a potential confrontation. Dr. Robinson worked feverishly to download as much data as possible, while others barricaded the entrance with whatever they could find. Carl kept his eyes locked on Gia, silently willing her to make the right choice. The fate of not just their small group, but potentially all of humanity hung in the balance. The sound of the blast doors beginning to open filled the air, and Carl braced himself for whatever came next. As the gap widened, he found himself face to face with Gia, her decision about to shape the course of their future. The blast doors parted, revealing Gia's conflicted expression. Time seemed to stand still as Carl held his breath, the fate of their group hanging in the balance. Then in a swift motion that caught everyone off guard, Gia stepped through the opening and sealed the doors behind her. "I believe you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What my people are doing is wrong. I can't be part of this any longer." Relief washed over Carl, but he knew they weren't out of danger yet. "We need to move quickly," he urged, turning to the others. "Gia, can you get us out of here?" The Risian nodded, her slender fingers flying over a nearby control panel. "I can override the facility's lockdown, but it won't go unnoticed. We'll have to fight our way out." As alarms blared throughout the complex, Carl and the other humans prepared for their escape. They fashioned makeshift weapons from lab equipment, their faces set with unyielding commitment. Dr. Robinson clutched a data drive containing the damning evidence they'd uncovered. Gia led the way, navigating the labyrinthine corridors with practiced ease. The group moved swiftly, their bare feet padding silently on the cold floor. At each intersection, Gia used her security clearance to misdirect pursuing guards, buying them precious time. They encountered their first real resistance as they neared a security checkpoint. Two Risian guards, their blue skins stark against their dark uniforms, raised energy weapons. Carl reacted instinctively, tackling one guard, while Gia disarmed the other with a precise strike. The brief skirmish left Carl breathless, his heart pounding. He caught Gia's eye, a moment of unspoken understanding passing between them. There was no going back now. As they pressed on, Carl found himself working in tandem with Gia, their movements almost synchronized. She guided them through the facility's defenses, while he used his newfound strength, a side effect of the Risian experiments, to protect the group. "The hangar bay is just ahead," Gia announced as they rounded a corner. "If we can secure a shuttle, we might have a chance." The hangar doors loomed before them, a final obstacle between captivity and freedom. Gia's access codes granted them entry, revealing a cavernous space filled with sleek Risian shuttlecraft. "Everyone, move!" Carl shouted, ushering the group toward the nearest vessel. As they rushed to board, a harsh voice cut through the air. "Stop right there, traitors!" Carl whirled to see Commander Zex, the Risian officer who had overseen his torturous milking sessions, leading a squad of heavily armed soldiers into the hangar. The commander's eyes blazed with fury as he raised his weapon. "Gia, get them on board," Carl ordered, stepping forward to face the Risian threat. What happened next surprised even Carl. As Zex fired, Carl's body moved with inhuman speed and precision. He dodged the energy blast, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. His fist connected with Zex's jaw, sending the commander sprawling. The other humans joined the fray, wielding their improvised weapons against the Risian soldiers. The hangar erupted into chaos, energy blasts scorching the air as the two sides clashed. In the midst of the battle, Carl heard Gia cry out in pain. He turned to see her clutching her side, blue blood seeping between her fingers. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms and raced for the shuttle. "Go, go," he yelled as he carried Gia up the boarding ramp. Dr. Robinson was already at the controls, her fingers dancing across the alien interface. The shuttle's engines roared to life as Carl secured Gia in a seat. He looked out the viewport to see Zex, face contorted with rage, firing futilely at their escaping vessel. "You won't escape." Zex's voice crackled over the shuttle's comm system. "I'll hunt you to the ends of the galaxy if I have to." The hangar bay doors began to close, but Dr. Robinson expertly maneuvered the shuttle through the narrowing gap. They burst into open space, the vastness of the starry expanse stretching before them. As the adrenaline of their escape began to subside, Carl turned his attention to Gia. Her breathing was labored, her blue skin paler than usual. He tore strips from his flimsy garment to bandage her wound, his touch gentle despite his rugged appearance. "Why did you help us?" he asked softly, his eyes searching hers. Gia winced as she shifted in her seat. "I've been part of a secret faction opposing the breeding program," she explained. "When I saw the evidence you uncovered, I knew I had to act. What we're doing to your people, it's unforgivable." Their moment was interrupted by Dr. Robinson's urgent voice. "We've got company, Risian ships in pursuit, and there's a tracking device on board." Carl's mind raced as he processed this new threat. He looked at Gia, then at the determined faces of his fellow humans. They had come too far to fail now. "Doctor, can you disable the tracker?" he asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. As Dr. Robinson worked to neutralize the device, Carl returned to Gia's side. She grasped his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "There's more you need to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Other facilities on Earth, weaknesses in our defenses. I can help you fight back." Carl nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. But as he opened his mouth to speak, Dr. Robinson's gas drew his attention to the front viewport. There, emerging from behind Earth's moon, was a massive Rissian mothership. Its size dwarfed anything Carl had ever seen, a city in space previously hidden from human detection. "My God," Dr. Robinson breathed. "The invasion, it's already here." Carl's mind focused as he surveyed the scene before them. The approaching Rissian pursuit ships, the looming mothership, and the blue marble of Earth beyond. They were outgunned and outnumbered, with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. But as he felt Gia's hand in his, saw the drive in Dr. Robinson's eyes, and remembered the resilience of his fellow escapees, Carl knew this was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. "Take us in," he said, his voice filled with quiet willpower. "We're going to infiltrate that mothership." As the shuttle hurtled towards the heart of the Rissian invasion force, Carl and Gia exchanged a look of shared purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Together. The gravity of their mission deeply affected on Carl's mind as he guided the shuttle towards the imposing Rissian mothership. Suddenly, the shuttle rocked violently, nearly throwing Carl off his feet. Dr. Robinson's voice rang out from the cockpit. "We've got company. Rissian pursuit ships closing in fast." Carl steadied himself against a bulkhead, his mind racing. They were so close to their goal, but the Rissian forces were determined not to let them reach it. He glanced at Gia, who was grimacing in pain but still alert. "Any ideas?" he asked, hoping her insider knowledge might provide an advantage. Gia's eyes lit up. "The shuttle's systems, we can use them to create a diversion." Working together, Carl and Dr. Robinson quickly implemented Gia's suggestion. They programmed the shuttle's computers to release a swarm of small unmanned probes, each mimicking their vessel's signature. "Launching decoys now," Dr. Robinson announced, her fingers flying over the controls. Through the view screen, Carl watched as dozens of tiny objects burst from the shuttle, scattering in all directions. The pursuing Rissian ships hesitated, their formation breaking as they split up to chase the phantom signals. "It's working!" Carl exclaimed, a surge of hope rising in his chest. With the immediate threat neutralized, he turned his attention back to Gia. Her blue skin had paled, and her breathing was labored. Carl carefully changed her bandages, his touch gentle despite the urgency of their situation. As he worked, their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them, a connection that transcended their biological differences. Carl felt a tug of emotion he couldn't quite name, but there was no time to dwell on it. "We're approaching the mothership," Dr. Robinson called out. "Gia, we need those access codes." Gia pushed herself up, wincing slightly. She made her way to the console, entering a complex sequence of commands. "This should get us into a maintenance bay without triggering any alarms." The shuttle glided silently into the massive Rissian vessel, settling down in a deserted docking area. As the engines powered down, the team gathered to formulate their plan. "Dr. Robinson, you stay with the shuttle," Carl said. "We may need a quick exit. Gia and I will infiltrate the ship, gather intel, and see if we can sabotage their plans." With a nod of agreement, Carl and Gia slipped out of the shuttle and into the bowels of the Rissian mothership. The corridors were a maze of sleek, alien architecture, but Gia navigated them with confidence. As they rounded a corner, voices drifted from a nearby room. Carl pulled Gia back, pressing them both against the wall. Peering around the edge, they saw a group of Rissian scientists engrossed in conversation. "The breeding program is proceeding as planned," one scientist said. "The genetic defect has been successfully integrated into 97% of the human population." Another scientist chimed in, "All our research is stored in the central database. We can monitor the progress of the defects spread in real time." Carl's heart raced. This was the information they needed. He glanced at Gia, who nodded in understanding. They needed to find that central database. As the scientists moved on, Gia led Carl to a nearby terminal. Her fingers danced across the alien interface, bypassing security protocols with ease. "I can locate the database from here," she whispered, her eyes scanning the information scrolling across the screen. Suddenly, an ear-splitting alarm blared through the ship. Red lights pulsed along the corridors, and the sound of running feet echoed in the distance. "They've detected us," Carl hissed, scanning for an escape route. Without thinking, he grabbed Gia and pulled her into a nearby storage compartment. The space was tight, forcing their bodies close together. Carl could feel the warmth of Gia's skin, her rapid heartbeat a stark reminder of her alien physiology. They held their breath as a group of guards rushed past their hiding spot. When the sound of footsteps faded, Carl and Gia exhaled in unison, their faces mere inches apart. The tension between them was palpable, but the gravity of their mission pushed any other thoughts aside. Emerging from their hiding place, Gia quickly returned to the terminal. "I found the central database," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "But it's deep within the ship, heavily guarded and protected by multiple security systems." Carl's mind raced, searching for a solution. His eyes fell on a nearby laboratory filled with advanced Rissian biotechnology. An idea began to form. "If we can't reach the database," he said slowly, "maybe we can use their own tech against them. Create a virus to infect their systems and reverse what they've done to humans." Gia's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and admiration crossing her face. That could work, but we'll need to act fast." They slipped into the lab, working in tandem to create the virus. Carl marveled at how well they complemented each other, his innovative thinking paired with Gia's deep knowledge of Rissian systems. Just as they finished, Commander Zex's voice boomed through the ship's communication system. "Attention all personnel. Human intruders and a Rissian traitor have infiltrated the ship. Find them at all costs." Carl and Gia shared a determined look. They had the virus, but now they needed to upload it and escape before they were cornered. As they prepared to leave the lab, Carl clutched the data device containing their creation, knowing that the fate of humanity rested in their hands. With the ship on high alert and their time running out, Carl and Gia stepped out of the laboratory, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in their mission to save the human race. The corridors stretched before them, a labyrinth of alien technology and hidden dangers. Carl's muscles tensed as he led the way, Gia close behind, her labored breathing a constant reminder of her injury. They moved swiftly but cautiously, ducking into alcoves and side passages whenever the sound of approaching Rissian patrols echoed through the ship. Carl's heightened senses, a result of the experiments performed on him, proved invaluable as they navigated the treacherous environment. "There," Gia whispered, pointing to a less guarded section of the ship. "That terminal should give us access to the main computer systems." They approached the terminal, Carl's eyes darting back and forth, watching for any sign of danger. Gia's fingers flew across the alien interface, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked to upload their hastily created virus. "How long?" Carl asked, his voice low and urgent. "Just a few more seconds," Gia replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. The moment stretched, tension building in Carl's chest. Then suddenly the terminal beeped, and Gia's face lit up with triumph. "It's done," she said. "The virus is in the system." No sooner had the words left her mouth than chaos erupted around them. Alarms blared, their harsh wail reverberating through the ship's structure. Emergency lights began to flash, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. "Time to move, Carl said, grabbing Gia's hand and pulling her away from the terminal. They raced through the corridors, taking advantage of the confusion that now gripped the Rissian crew. Disoriented aliens stumbled past them, barely registering their presence as they rushed to respond to the perceived threat. As they rounded a corner, Carl skidded to a halt. Before them stood a group of humans, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion. They were being herded along by Rissian guards who seemed equally unsettled by the ship's sudden malfunction. Carl's heart raced. He couldn't leave these people behind. He turned to Gia, seeing the conflict in her eyes. "We have to help them," he said firmly. Gia hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I can use my access codes to release the restraints, but we'll need to act fast." Working in tandem, they sprang into action. Carl engaged the guards, his movements a blur of precision and power. He disarmed one Rissian, using the alien weapon to incapacitate the others. Meanwhile, Gia accessed a nearby control panel, her fingers dancing across the interface as she input a series of complex codes. With a satisfying click, the restraints fell away from the human captives. Carl quickly ushered them forward, explaining the situation in hurried whispers. "Follow us," he instructed. "We're getting out of here." The group moved swiftly through the ship, Carl and Gia leading the way. They were nearly at the shuttle bay when a familiar voice rang out, stopping them in their tracks. "So, the traitors think they can escape," Commander Zex growled, stepping into view with a squad of elite Rizian soldiers at his back. Carl pushed the freed humans behind him, his body tensing for combat. Beside him, Gia raised her weapon, her face set in relentless drive. The corridor erupted into chaos as both sides engaged. Energy blasts sizzled through the air, leaving scorch marks on the walls. Carl noticed with surprise that some of the Rizian weapons were malfunctioning, firing erratically or not at all. The virus had affected more than just the ship's navigation systems. Using this unexpected advantage, Carl charged forward, closing the distance between himself and Commander Zex. The Rizian leader snarled, discarding his malfunctioning weapon and meeting Carl's advance with his bare hands. The two grappled, a stark contrast in size and strength. Yet Carl found himself holding his own, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to dodge Zex's powerful blows and land strikes of his own. "Aim for the base of his neck," Gia called out, her voice barely audible over the sounds of combat. "It's a weak point in Rizian physiology." Carl didn't hesitate. He feinted left, then drove his fist upward, connecting solidly with the spot Gia had indicated. Commander Zex's eyes widened in shock, then rolled back as he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. With their leader fallen, the remaining Rizian soldiers faltered. Carl, Gia, and the freed humans pressed their advantage, fighting their way through to the shuttle bay. They burst through the doors to find Dr. Robinson engaged in her own battle, using the shuttle's external defenses to keep a group of Rizian technicians at bay. Seeing Carl and the others, she quickly cleared a path for them. "Get everyone on board," Carl shouted, providing cover fire as the humans scrambled into the shuttle. As the last of the freed captives boarded, Carl felt the deck beneath his feet shudder. The virus was taking its toll on the mothership systems, causing it to lose altitude and drift towards Earth. Carl's mind raced as he realized the devastating impact the ship's crash could have on populated areas below. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. "Dr. Robinson," he called out, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart, "get these people to safety. I'm staying behind to try and steer this thing away from populated areas." Dr. Robinson's eyes widened in shock, but before she could protest, Gia stepped forward. "I'm staying too," she said, her hand finding Carl's and squeezing it tightly. Carl turned to her, surprise and gratitude mixing with a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a wordless understanding passed between them. "Go," Carl urged Dr. Robinson. "We'll do what we can from here." As the shuttle's engines roared to life, Carl and Gia turned towards the heart of the Rizian mothership, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in their desperate attempt to save countless lives on the planet below. Below, Carl and Gia braced themselves as the ship's systems failed catastrophically, sending them plummeting towards Earth's surface. The impact was violent and jarring. Water rushed in from all sides as the Rizian mothership crashed into the Pacific Ocean. The force of the collision sent Carl and Gia tumbling through the corridors, desperately grasping for something to hold on to as the ship began to break apart. By sheer luck, they found themselves trapped in an air pocket within the rapidly sinking vessel. Gasping for breath, they clung to each other in the darkness, feeling the ship lurch and groan around them. "We need to find a way out," Carl said, his voice tight with urgency. Gia nodded, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "There should be emergency escape pods nearby. If we can reach one, we might have a chance." They moved carefully through the flooding compartments, Gia's knowledge of Rizian ship design guiding their way. The water rose steadily, forcing them to swim through submerged sections. Finally, they reached a row of sleek, oval-shaped pods. Gia's fingers danced across the control panel, activating the nearest one. The hatch hissed open, revealing a cramped interior. "Get in!" Carl urged, helping Gia inside before climbing in after her. The pod sealed shut just as another wave of water crashed through the chamber. With a violent jerk, it ejected from the sinking mothership, rocketing toward the surface. As they breached the waves, Carl and Gia watched in awe as the massive Rizian vessel broke apart, disappearing beneath the churning ocean. The magnitude of what they'd accomplished hit them both at once. "We did it," Gia whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Carl nodded, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. "But at what cost?" They activated the pod's distress beacon, hoping it would be picked up by human rescue teams. As they waited, floating on the vast expanse of the Pacific, they took stock of their injuries. Carl winced as he examined a deep gash on his arm. "Must have happened during the crash," he muttered. Gia gently took his arm, her cool fingers probing the wound. "Let me help," she said softly, reaching for the pod's first aid kit. As she tended to his injury, Carl couldn't help but notice the grace of her movements, the concern in her eyes. Despite everything they'd been through, despite their biological differences, he felt drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. Gia looked up, catching his gaze. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their shared experiences hanging between them. Then slowly, almost hesitantly, Carl leaned in. Their lips met, tentative at first, then with growing passion. It was a kiss born of adrenaline, relief, and something deeper, a connection forged in the crucible of their desperate mission. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Gia's skin had taken on a faint, bioluminescent glow, a Rizian response to heightened emotion, Carl realized. I've never felt this way about a human before," Gia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I've never felt this way about anyone," he replied. Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by a loud ping from the pod's communication system. A human voice crackled through the speaker. "Unidentified vessel, this is the USS Hawkins. We've picked up your distress signal. Prepare to be brought aboard." Relief flooded through Carl, but it was tinged with apprehension. How would they explain everything that had happened? As the naval ship approached, its massive form dwarfing their tiny pod, Carl took Gia's hand. "Whatever happened," he said, "we're in this together." Gia nodded, squeezing his hand in return. "Together," she agreed. The pod was drawn into the ship's hangar bay with a metallic clang. As the hatch opened, they were met with a squad of armed Marines, their weapons trained on the pod's occupants. A stern-faced woman stepped forward, her captain's insignia gleaming on her uniform. "I'm Captain Sarah Hawkins," she announced. "You two are hereby detained for questioning. Guards, separate them and escort them to the brig." "Wait," Carl protested as rough hands pulled him away from Gia. "You don't understand. We're not the enemy. We just saved humanity from the risen threat." Captain Hawkins's expression remained impassive. "That remains to be seen. You'll both be thoroughly interrogated. If you are who you claim to be, you have nothing to fear." As they were led away, Carl caught one last glimpse of Gia being taken in the opposite direction. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own, but beneath it, he saw a flicker of perseverance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had everything else, together. The ship hummed with activity as news of their arrival spread. Carl could only imagine the global panic unfolding as the world learned of the alien threat. As he was marched through the corridors, he overheard snippets of frantic communications, reports of strange sightings in the skies over major cities. Their victory, it seemed, was far from complete. The real battle for Earth's future was only just beginning. The real battle for Earth's future was only just starting to unfold. As Carl was led to his holding cell, his mind raced with possibilities. He knew they needed to convince Captain Hawkins of their story quickly, or all would be lost. Suddenly, a commotion erupted in the corridor. Alarms blared, and the ship lurched violently. "We're under attack," a crewman shouted, rushing past Carl and his guards. In the chaos, Carl seized his opportunity. He broke free from his captors and sprinted down the hallway, searching for Gia. He found her being escorted by 2 Marines, her eyes wide with concern. "Carl," she called out, "what's happening?" Before he could answer, the ship shuddered again. The lights flickered, and for a moment, they were plunged into darkness. When emergency power kicked in, Carl saw Captain Hawkins striding towards them, her face grim. "It seems your story might have some truth to it after all," she said, eyeing Carl and Gia warily. "We're picking up massive energy signatures in orbit. Something big is happening, and I need answers now." Carl nodded, relief washing over him. "We can help, but we need to act fast. Gia can interface with the Rizian network and gather critical intelligence." Captain Hawkins hesitated for a moment, then made her decision. "Do it. But I'm warning you, any sign of betrayal, and you'll both be back in the brig faster than you can blink." They rushed to the ship's command center, a hive of activity as crew members monitored multiple screens displaying the unfolding crisis. Gia approached a terminal, her hands hovering over the interface. "I need direct access to your communications array," she explained. "It's the only way I can reach the Rizian network from here." As the necessary connections were made, Carl stood by Gia's side, his hand on her shoulder. "Be careful," he whispered. Gia nodded, then closed her eyes. The moment she connected to the system, her body went rigid. Carl held her tightly as she began to convulse, her face contorted in pain. "Gia!" he cried out, panic rising in his chest. He turned to the others, desperation in his voice. "We need to disconnect her." But before anyone could move, Gia's eyes snapped open. They glowed with an eerie blue light, and when she spoke, her voice seemed to echo with thousands of others. "I am connected to the collective consciousness of the Rizian fleet," she said, her tone otherworldly and distant. "I see their plans, their intentions." Carl listened intently as Gia revealed the Rizians' last resort protocol, Operation Seed Harvest. The horror of their plan to lift entire human cities from the Earth's surface sent a chill down his spine. As Gia struggled to maintain her mental link, she managed to upload the modified virus into the Rizian fleet's central network. The effect was immediate and visible on the command center's screens. Across the globe, Rizian ships began to lose power and fall from the sky. However, their victory was short-lived. The largest vessels, including several massive harvester ships, remained operational. Suddenly, Gia's connection to the Rizian network was violently severed. She collapsed into Carl's arms, weak but alive. As he cradled her, she gasped out crucial information about the Rizian homeworld and a hidden base on the far side of Earth's moon. Captain Hawkins, witnessing the effectiveness of their efforts, ordered her crew to transmit the virus code to military commands worldwide. But even as human forces began to turn the tide of the battle, a new threat emerged. The remaining Rizian harvester ships, immune to the virus, began their assault on major cities. On the main view screen, they watched in horror as colossal energy beams descended on New York, Tokyo, and London, lifting millions of screaming humans into the sky. "We need to stop them," Carl said, his voice tight with urgency. "Captain, we have to strike at the source. The lunar base Gia mentioned. It must be the control center for these harvester ships." Captain Hawkins nodded grimly. "Agreed. I'm assembling a strike team immediately. You two are coming with us." As preparations for the lunar mission began, a transmission came through from Dr. Robinson. Her face appeared on screen, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "Carl, Gia, I've made a breakthrough," she said quickly. "The genetic modifications made to Carl during his captivity, they're more extensive than we realized. Carl, you're capable of interfacing with Rizian technology at a level even Gia can't match." The implications of this revelation hit Carl like a physical blow. He looked at his hands, suddenly feeling alien in his own skin. Gia reached out and took his hand, her touch grounding him. "This could be our best chance to shut down the harvester ships," Captain Hawkins said, her tone leaving no room for argument. As the strike team prepared to board their hastily modified spacecraft, Carl and Gia shared a moment alone. Gia's eyes were filled with fear, not for herself, but for him. "I'm scared, Carl," she admitted softly. "What if using these abilities changes you? What if I lose you to this alien part of yourself?" Carl cupped her face gently, looking into her eyes. "Listen to me, Gia. No matter what happens, no matter what I become, My love for you will never change. It's the most human part of me, and it always will be. They boarded the ship, strapping themselves in as the engines roared to life. Through the viewports, they could see the harvester ships continuing their grim work, entire city blocks suspended in shimmering energy fields. As their ship accelerated towards the moon, Carl gripped Gia's hand tightly. The fate of humanity and the future of their interspecies love hung in the balance. Whatever challenges lay ahead on the lunar surface, they would face them together. The ship streaked through Earth's atmosphere, leaving behind a world in chaos as they raced towards the hidden Rizian base and the final confrontation that awaited them. The lunar surface loomed large in the viewports as their ship hurtled towards its destination. Carl's grip on Gia's hand tightened, his squeezing hard with tension. Captain Hawkins expertly maneuvered the craft, her face a mask of concentration. Suddenly, brilliant beams of energy erupted from the moon's surface, slicing through the void of space towards them. The ship rocked violently as Hawkins executed a series of evasive maneuvers, narrowly avoiding the deadly barrage. Rizian defense system, Gia shouted over the blaring alarms. We need to find a way past it. Carl nodded, closing his eyes and reaching out with his mind. The alien presence within him surged forward, and he felt himself connecting to the lunar base's systems. A torrent of data flooded his consciousness, threatening to overwhelm him. He gasped, his body rigid in his seat. Gia placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, her touch anchoring him to reality. I've got you, she whispered. With her support, Carl navigated the labyrinthine Rizian network. Alien symbols and concepts flashed through his mind at dizzying speeds. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a weak point in the base's sensor grid. There, he called out, his eyes snapping open. I've created a blind spot. Captain, fly us in on these coordinates. Hawkins nodded grimly, adjusting their course. The ship dove towards the lunar surface, slipping through the gap in the Rizian defenses. They touched down with a gentle thud, a plume of moon dust rising around them. The strike team moved swiftly, donning their spacesuits and cycling through the airlock. Carl and Gia took point, leading the group towards an emergency entrance Carl had located in the base's schematics. Inside, the corridors were eerily silent. The team's movements were hampered by the low gravity, each step requiring careful control to avoid floating away. Carl's enhanced senses tingled, guiding them through the maze-like structure. This way, he whispered, gesturing down a dimly lit passageway. The control room is just ahead. As they approached their target, Carl stumbled, overwhelmed by a sudden influx of Rizian memories and knowledge. Vivid flashes of alien worlds and advanced technologies bombarded his mind. He would have fallen if not for Gia's quick reflexes. She caught him, her eyes filled with concern. Carl, what's happening? He shook his head, trying to clear it. The Rizian influence. It's getting stronger. We need to hurry. They reached the control room door. Carl interfaced with the locking mechanism, and it slid open with a soft hiss. The team surged forward, catching the handful of Rizian operators completely off guard. A firefight erupted, brief but intense. Carl moved with inhuman speed and precision, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to dodge energy blasts and take down multiple opponents. Gia was equally formidable, her intimate knowledge of Rizian physiology guiding her attacks to their most vulnerable points. Within minutes, the room was secure. Carl rushed to the main computer terminal, his fingers flying over the alien interface. The others watched in awe as streams of incomprehensible data flowed across the screens. I've found it, Carl announced, his voice tight with urgency. Operation Seed Harvest. They're planning to transport the captured humans to a massive space station orbiting their homeworld. The harvesters are being controlled from here. He attempted to shut down the harvester ships, but his commands were met with resistance. Frustration etched across his face. Carl turned to the others. I can't override the system remotely. I need to make a direct neural link. Gia's eyes widened in alarm. Carl, no! The strain could kill you. Before he could respond, alarms blared throughout the base. Security monitors flickered to life, showing a massive Rizian battleship approaching the moon. Captain Hawkins cursed under her breath. That's got to be their reinforcements. We need to move fast. Carl locked eyes with Gia, his expression resolute. There's no other choice. I have to do this. As the strike team rushed to set up defensive positions, Carl prepared for the neural link. Gia helped him into a chair, her movements gentle despite the urgency of their situation. I'll be right here, she promised, squeezing his hand. Carl nodded, then closed his eyes and opened his mind fully to the Rishian network. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. His body went rigid, convulsing violently as his consciousness merged with the alien collective. In this mental realm, Carl found himself facing the combined will of the Rishian High Command. Their intentions, fears, and desperation washed over him in waves. He pushed back, fighting to maintain his sense of self amidst the alien onslaught. As Carl battled for control, blood trickled from his nose and ears. Gia held him tightly, tears streaming down her face as she watched the man she loved fight for humanity's survival. Outside, the sound of weapons fire grew closer. Commander Zex's forces had breached the base and were pushing toward the control room. Captain Hawkins barked orders to her team, coordinating their defense. Gia found herself torn, wanting to protect Carl but knowing her skills were needed in the fight. She placed a gentle kiss on his forehead, then reluctantly joined her comrades at the barricade. In the depths of the Rishian network, Carl made a startling discovery. The aliens' desperate plan was born of their own impending extinction, the result of genetic modifications gone horribly wrong. They saw humanity's genetic diversity as their last hope for survival. Drawing on his newfound knowledge, Carl projected a vision of an alternative future, one where humans and Rishians work together, their strengths complementing each other. He showed them the potential for both species to thrive through cooperation rather than conflict. As Carl's mental struggle reached its peak, the physical battle outside intensified. Commander Zex's forces pushed closer to the control room, their weapons fire growing more intense by the second. Carl stood at the precipice, his consciousness balanced between convincing the Rishian collective and being consumed by their alien mind. The fate of two species hung in the balance as the battle raged around his vulnerable form. Body. The fate of two species hung in the balance as the battle raged around his vulnerable form. Suddenly, Carl's eyes snapped open, glowing with an otherworldly blue light. His body relaxed, no longer rigid with tension. In the Rishian network, his consciousness had reached a pivotal moment. Drawing on the full extent of his unique genetic modifications, Carl projected a compelling vision of cooperation between humans and Rishians. The alien collective reeled from the force of his mental argument. Carl's human perspective, combined with his newfound understanding of Rishian culture and biology, created a bridge between the two species. He showed them a future where human genetic diversity could be the key to solving the Rishians' impending extinction, without the need for invasion or harvesting. As Carl's vision spread through the network, the Rishian High Command began to waver. Their initial resistance crumbled in the face of this unexpected alternative. One by one, the alien leaders accepted Carl's proposal, their collective will shifting towards peace. In an instant, the tide of the battle turned. The harvester ships across Earth powered down, their energy fields dissipating. Millions of captive humans were gently lowered back to the planet's surface, dazed but unharmed. Carl's connection to the Rishian network abruptly severed. He slumped forward, completely drained. Gia, who had been defending their position, rushed to his side. She caught him just before he hit the ground, cradling his unconscious form in her arms. "Carl," she cried, her voice thick with worry. She checked his vital signs, relief washing over her as she felt his steady pulse. Captain Hawkins approached, her weapon lowered but still at the ready. "What happened?" she demanded, surveying the suddenly quiet control room. Gia looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. I think he did it. The harvester ships have stopped." As if to confirm her words, the sounds of battle outside the control room ceased. The strike team members exchanged confused glances, their weapons still raised. "Secure the area," Hawkins ordered, "and get me a line to Earth Command. We need to know what's happening out there." While the team worked to establish communications, Gia focused on Carl. She gently wiped the blood from his face, noting with concern the faint blue tinge spreading across his skin. His breathing was shallow but steady, his eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids. Hours passed in tense silence. The strike team fortified their position, wary of any potential Rizian counterattack. Gia refused to leave Carl's side, monitoring his condition closely. Finally, Carl stirred. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. "Gia," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm here," she said, squeezing his hand. "You did it, Carl. You stopped the invasion." He attempted to sit up, wincing at the effort. Gia supported him, helping him into a more comfortable position. As he moved, Carl noticed the changes to his body. He stared at his hands, now a pale blue, flexing his fingers experimentally. "What's happened to me?" he asked, a note of fear in his voice. Before Gia could answer, Captain Hawkins approached. "We've made contact with Earth Command," she reported. "The Rizian fleet has withdrawn to a high orbit. They're requesting to open diplomatic channels." Carl nodded, processing the information. He reached out almost instinctively towards a nearby Rizian console. As his fingers touched the alien technology, information flooded his mind. He gasped, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of data. I can understand it all now," he said, amazed. "Their language, their technology. It's like it's part of me." Gia watched him with a mixture of awe and concern. "Your connection to their network must have changed you on a fundamental level," she said softly. Carl met her gaze, searching for any sign of revulsion or fear. Instead, he found only love and acceptance in her eyes. He squeezed her hand, grateful for her unwavering support. Captain Hawkins cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the matter at hand. "If you're able, we need your help establishing communication with the Rizian leadership. We're flying blind here, and Earth's governments are clamoring for information." Carl nodded, slowly getting to his feet with Gia's assistance. He approached the main control panel, his movements becoming more confident as he interfaced with the Rizian technology. His fingers danced across the alien symbols, effortlessly navigating the complex systems. "I'm opening a channel to both the Rizian fleet and Earth's military command," he announced. "We need to start negotiations immediately, before anyone gets trigger-happy." As Carl worked, Gia and Captain Hawkins exchanged a worried glance. The changes to Carl's body were becoming more pronounced. His eyes had grown slightly larger, and his facial structure was subtly shifting to resemble Rizian features. Despite these physical alterations, Carl's willpower and focus remained purely human. He worked tirelessly, translating between the two species and laying the groundwork for formal peace talks. Hours stretched into days as the delicate negotiations progressed. Carl and Gia became central figures in the discussions, their unique bond serving as a living example of human-Rizian cooperation. Carl's enhanced abilities allowed him to bridge the vast gulfs of language and culture that separated the two species, while Gia's insight and compassion helped smooth over moments of tension and misunderstanding. As the framework for a lasting peace began to take shape, a new challenge emerged. Reports came in of a Rizian battleship breaking formation, its weapons powering up as it moved into an attack position near Earth. Carl's eyes widened as he processed the incoming Rizian communications. "It's Commander Zex," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "He's gathered a group of hardliners who oppose the peace agreement. They're threatening to resume the invasion unless we abandon the negotiations." Captain Hawkins swore under her breath. "Can we stop them?" Carl's mind raced, considering their options. His gaze fell on the advanced systems of the lunar base, and an idea began to form. "I think I can disable their ship from here," he said slowly, "but I'll need to fully link with the Rizian network again. It's risky. I don't know what it might do to me." Gia gripped his arm, her eyes filled with fear. "Carl, no. You can't risk losing yourself in their collective again." He cupped her face gently, his now alien features softening with love. "I have to try, Gia. Everything we've worked for is at stake." As Carl prepared to immerse himself once more in the Rizian network, tension filled the control room. The fate of two worlds hung in the balance, dependent on the actions of a man caught between two species. With a deep breath, Carl closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, plunging into the alien datascape that could save humanity, or cost him his very self. The alien collective surged around him, threatening to overwhelm his consciousness. But Carl held firm, drawing on his unique hybrid physiology to navigate the complex network. With laser-like focus, Carl located Commander Zex's ship within the Rizian fleet. He could sense the rebellious crew's commitment, their minds a chaotic swirl of fear and aggression. Reaching out with his newfound abilities, Carl began to systematically shut down the ship's weapon systems. Alarms blared throughout the lunar base as the Rizian battleship opened fire. Energy blasts rocked the facility, but Carl remained motionless, his mind locked in cyber combat with Zex's forces. Gia watched anxiously, her hand gripping Carl's shoulder. "Come on, Carl," she whispered. "You can do this." Suddenly, Carl's eyes flew open, glowing with an intense blue light. "It's done," he gasped, his voice raspy and strained. "Their weapons are offline." Captain Hawkins quickly relayed the information to Earth's defense forces. Within minutes, the rebellious Rizian ship was surrounded and forced to stand down. As the immediate crisis passed, the full weight of Carl's actions settled over the control room. He slumped in his chair, exhausted and disoriented. Gia knelt beside him, her face etched with concern. "Carl, are you okay?" she asked, gently touching his face. He blinked, struggling to focus on her. I think so. Everything feels different." He looked down at his hands, now a deeper shade of blue, the skin slightly textured like Rizian hide. Captain Hawkins approached, her expression a mixture of awe and unease. "What you did was incredible, Carl. You may have just saved both our worlds." Carl nodded weakly, still coming to terms with his transformed state. "The connection? It's changed me. I can feel it." As the team worked to secure the lunar base and establish communications with both Earth and the Rizian fleet, Carl and Gia found a quiet moment alone. She helped him to a small rest area, easing him onto a cot. "I'm scared, Gia," Carl admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm becoming." Gia took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his altered digits. "We'll figure this out together," she promised. "No matter what happens, I'm here for you." Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by Captain Hawkins. "I hate to break this up, but we need you both. The peace talks are about to resume, and you're our best chance at making this work." In the months that followed, Carl and Gia found themselves at the forefront of a new era in human-Rishian relations. The newly formed Human-Rishian Cooperative Council relied heavily on their unique insights and Carl's ability to bridge the gap between the two species. But as they worked tirelessly to build a lasting peace, Carl's condition continued to evolve. His skin took on a more pronounced blue hue, and his facial features subtly shifted to resemble Rizian physiology. More alarmingly, he began experiencing periodic seizures and moments of disorientation. During one particularly intense council meeting, Carl suddenly clutched his head and collapsed. Gia rushed to his side as he convulsed on the floor, his eyes rolling back in his head. "We need medical assistance," she shouted, cradling Carl's shaking form. Dr. Emily Robinson, who had been observing the meeting, sprang into action. She quickly assessed Carl's condition, her brow furrowed with concern. "His hybrid physiology is destabilizing," she muttered, reaching for a hypospray. "We need to get him to the research facility on the lunar base immediately." As they prepared to transport Carl, Gia overheard two Rizian scientists whispering excitedly. "His transformation is progressing faster than we anticipated," one said. "If we could replicate this process—" Gia's eyes narrowed. She stepped between them and Carl's unconscious form, her voice low and dangerous. "He's not your lab rat. He's a person, and he needs help." The Rizian scientists backed away, chastened but still eyeing Carl with barely concealed interest. On the lunar base, Dr. Robinson and her team worked around the clock to stabilize Carl's condition. Gia rarely left his side, watching anxiously as he drifted in and out of consciousness. During one of his lucid moments, Carl reached out and touched a nearby console. To everyone's amazement, the Rizian technology responded instantly, displays flickering to life and data streaming across the screens. "Incredible," Dr. Robinson breathed. "His connection to Rizian tech is getting stronger." Gia's joy at seeing Carl awake was tempered by the realization of how far he'd drifted from his human origins. She squeezed his hand, trying to hide her worry. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. Carl's now larger eyes focused on her, a mix of wonder and fear in their alien depths. Everything's so clear now, Gia. I can see so much. Before she could respond, alarms blared throughout the facility. A stern voice came over the intercom. Attention all personnel. This is General Marcus Blackwood. By order of Earth Command, this facility is now under military control. All research on Carl Davidson is to cease immediately. Gia's heart raced as she heard heavy footsteps approaching the medical bay. She looked at Carl, then at Dr. Robinson, her mind racing to find a way out of this new threat. As the door began to slide open, Carl's eyes suddenly glowed with that now familiar blue light. The Rysian technology around them hummed to life, responding to his unspoken command. In that moment, Gia realized that their fight for peace, and for Carl's humanity, was not nearly finished. As the door slid open, Carl's eyes pulsed with blue light, and the Rysian technology around them sprang to life. Gia felt a sudden surge of energy, and before she could process what was happening, the world around them blurred. When her vision cleared, Gia found herself standing on a metallic platform surrounded by towering spires of crystal and alien architecture. She blinked in disbelief, realizing they were no longer on the lunar base, but on the Rysian homeworld. Carl slumped against her, his breathing labored. I teleported us, he gasped, his skin now a deeper shade of blue. It was the only way to escape. Dr. Robinson stared at their surroundings in awe. Incredible, she breathed. But Carl, your condition... Before she could finish, Carl's body convulsed, and he collapsed to the ground. Gia cried out in alarm, cradling his head as his form flickered between human and Rysian features. We need help, Gia shouted, her voice echoing in the alien cityscape. As if in response to her plea, a group of Rysians approached, led by a tall, slender figure with iridescent skin. I am Dr. Zorn, the alien introduced himself, his multifaceted eyes examining Carl with intense curiosity. We detected the energy surge from your arrival. What has happened to this hybrid? Dr. Robinson quickly explained Carl's deteriorating condition as the Rysians helped move him to a nearby medical facility. Inside, Carl was placed on a floating examination table, surrounded by pulsating holographic displays. Dr. Zorn's appendages danced over the controls, his expression grave. His hybrid physiology is highly unstable. We must act quickly to save him. The Rysian scientist turned to Gia, his voice taking on a note of excitement. We have been developing a process to fully transform humans into Rysians. With your permission, we could... No, Gia interrupted firmly, her hand tightening around Carl's. We're not erasing his humanity. There has to be another way. Dr. Robinson stepped forward, her eyes bright with commitment. What if we combined our knowledge? A procedure that stabilizes his hybrid form rather than pushing him to either extreme? Dr. Zorn considered this for a moment, then nodded. It's risky, but possible. We'll need to act fast. As the medical team prepared for the procedure, a commotion outside caught their attention. General Blackwood had arrived with a contingent of human soldiers, demanding access to the facility. Carl Davidson is a valuable asset, the general's voice boomed through the communication system. We can't allow the Rysians to have sole control over his treatment. Gia stood her ground, facing the general through the view screen. This isn't about control, General. It's about saving Carl's life and preserving who he is. As tensions rose, Carl's body began to emit pulses of energy, interfering with the Rysian medical equipment. Alarms blared as power fluctuated throughout the facility. Dr. Zorn's eyes widened. We must begin now or we'll lose him. With a nod from Gia, the medical team sprang into action. Human and Rysian technologies merged as they worked to stabilize Carl's fluctuating physiology. His body shifted rapidly between forms, each transformation more violent than the last. Gia watched in horror as Carl's features blurred and reformed, his screams of pain echoing through the chamber. She longed to comfort him, but knew she couldn't interfere with the delicate procedure. Outside, General Blackwood continued to argue for access, citing security concerns. Dr. Robinson, her voice strained but firm, rebuffed his demands. This is a medical emergency, General. Your presence would only complicate things. Hours passed in a tense blur of activity. The medical team worked tirelessly, adjusting their approach with each new complication. Finally, as the twin suns of the Risian world began to set, Carl's body stabilized. Gia leaned in, her heart pounding as she took in Carl's new appearance. His skin retained a faint blue tint, but his features were undeniably human. Yet there was something more, a depth to his eyes that hinted at the Risian influence within him. Slowly, Carl's eyes fluttered open. He gazed at Gia, a smile spreading across his face. "Hey," he said softly, his voice a mixture of human and Risian tones. Tears of relief streamed down Gia's face as she embraced him. "Welcome back," she whispered. As Carl regained his strength, he began to realize the full extent of his transformation. He could interface with Risian technology more seamlessly than ever, yet his human memories and emotions remained intact. During a moment of quiet, Carl turned to Dr. Zorn, his expression thoughtful. "I think I understand now," he said. "The key to solving the Risian genetic problems isn't full hybridization. It's a targeted approach, introducing specific human genetic traits to complement Risian physiology." Dr. Zorn's eyes widened with interest. "Go on," he urged. Carl outlined his idea for a gene therapy that could address the Risians' genetic issues without compromising their unique biology. As he spoke, holographic displays around them came to life, illustrating his concepts in vivid detail. The Risian scientific community buzzed with excitement at Carl's proposal, but not everyone was pleased. Conservative factions on both sides viewed the idea with suspicion and fear. General Blackwood, who had been grudgingly allowed into the facility, scowled as he listened to Carl's explanation. "This is dangerous," he growled. "Giving the Risians access to human genetics could lead to them surpassing us entirely." Despite the opposition, Carl and Gia pressed forward with their vision. They worked closely with Dr. Zorn and his team to refine the gene therapy proposal, beginning preliminary trials on volunteer Risians. As news of their work spread, public opinion on Earth began to shift. Inspired by Carl and Gia's story, many humans became more open to the idea of cooperation with the Risians. One evening, as Carl and Gia watched the Risian sunset from a crystalline balcony, they allowed themselves a moment of hope. Carl's new form had brought them closer than ever, their bond a living example of what could be achieved through understanding and cooperation. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of explosions. Alarms blared throughout the research facility as a group of radical Risians launched an attack, determined to destroy Carl's work and eliminate the threat to their species' purity. Carl's eyes glowed blue as he interfaced with the facility's systems. "They've breached the outer defenses," he reported, his voice tense. "We need to protect the research data and the trial volunteers." Gia nodded, her expression resolute. "Then let's show them what humans and Risians can do when we work together." As they raced back into the facility, ready to defend their vision of a cooperative future, Carl and Gia knew that the greatest challenge to their work and their relationship lay ahead. The fate of both species hung in the balance, with one final trial to overcome before their dream of harmony could be realized. The fate of both species hung in the balance, with one final trial to overcome before their dream of harmony could be achieved. As Carl and Gia raced through the facility's corridors, the sound of explosions grew louder. Smoke filled the air, and the acrid smell of burning electronics assaulted their senses. Carl's eyes glowed an intense blue as he interfaced with the facility's systems, his fingers dancing across holographic displays that materialized before him. "I'm creating holographic decoys," he explained to Gia, his voice a blend of human and Risian tones. "It should confuse the attackers and buy us some time." Gia nodded, her expression determined. "Good thinking. I'll coordinate the evacuation of the scientists and secure the research data." As they worked in tandem, the chaos around them intensified. Human and Risian scientists scrambled to safety, clutching data crystals and prototypes. Carl's holographic decoys flickered to life throughout the facility, projecting images of fleeing personnel and false security measures. Suddenly, Carl froze, his eyes widening in shock. "No, it can't be," he whispered. "What is it?" Gia asked, concern etching her features. Carl's voice was grim as he responded, "I've identified the leader of the attack. It's Commander Zex." Gia gasped. "But how? We thought he was dead." "Apparently not," Carl said, his teeth clenched. "He's disguised himself, but I'd recognize his energy signature anywhere. He's gathered extremists from both species who fear our work." As they processed this revelation, a nearby explosion rocked the facility. Alarms blared, signaling that the outer defenses had been breached. Carl's mind raced, calculating their options. "Gia," he said, turning to face her, his eyes glowing with intensity. "I have an idea. It's risky, but it might be our only chance." "What are you thinking?" Gia asked, bracing herself against a wall as another explosion shook the building. Carl took a deep breath. "The experimental gene therapy we've been working on. I want to use it on myself." Gia's eyes widened. "Carl, that's incredibly dangerous. We haven't even begun human trials yet." "I know," he replied, his voice steady, "but my hybrid physiology might be able to handle it. If it works, it could unlock abilities we haven't even imagined. It might be the only way to stop Zex and save everything we've worked for." Gia searched Carl's face, seeing the perseverance in his alien eyes. She knew the risks, but she also understood the stakes. After a moment, she nodded. "Okay, let's do it." They rushed to the main research lab, Carl using his connection to the facility systems to clear their path and misdirect the attackers. Once inside, Gia quickly prepared the gene therapy, while Carl interfaced with the equipment, fine-tuning the process for his unique physiology. "Ready?" Gia asked, her hand hovering over the activation switch. Carl nodded, lying back on the treatment platform. "Do it." Gia activated the procedure, and a brilliant light enveloped Carl's body. He convulsed, his form pulsating with energy. Gia watched in awe and fear as Carl's features shifted, his skin taking on an iridescent blue hue, and his eyes glowing with an inner light. As the light faded, Carl sat up, his movements fluid and graceful. He looked at his hands, marveling at the shimmering patterns that danced across his skin. "How do you feel?" Gia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl's lips curved into a smile. "Incredible. It's like I can see and feel everything." Their moment of wonder was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Carl's eyes narrowed, and he stood, his new form radiating power. "It's time to end this," he said, his voice resonating with newfound strength. Carl strode out of the lab, Gia close behind him. They encountered a group of Zex's followers in the corridor, their weapons trained on the pair. With a mere thought, Carl disabled their weapons, the devices sparking and falling useless to the floor. The attackers backed away, fear and awe written across their faces. Carl raised his hand, projecting a calming aura. "We don't want to fight you," he said. "This conflict will only lead to more suffering for both our peoples." Some of the attackers lowered their guard, uncertainty replacing their hostility. Others remained defiant, but Carl's display of power had clearly shaken their drive. As they made their way through the facility, Carl continued to neutralize threats with ease. Weapons were rendered inert, force fields dissipated, and would-be attackers found themselves immobilized by Carl's newfound abilities. Finally, they reached the central atrium where Commander Zex stood, surrounded by his most loyal followers. The disguised Rizian's eyes widened as he took in Carl's transformed appearance. "What have you done to yourself?" Zex snarled, his voice a mixture of disgust and fear. Carl stepped forward, his iridescent skin glowing softly in the chaotic light of the damaged facility. "I've embraced the potential of both our species, Zex. This is the future you're fighting against. A future where humans and Rizians can achieve things neither of us could alone." Zex raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Carl reached out with his mind. The gun crumbled to dust in Zex's hands. The commander staggered back, his followers murmuring in confusion and awe. "It's over, Zex," Carl said, his voice firm but compassionate. "But it doesn't have to end in destruction. Let me show you what we can accomplish together." Carl extended his hand toward Zex, his eyes glowing with intensity. Suddenly, a flood of images filled the minds of everyone present. Visions of a future where humans and Rizians worked side by side, exploring the galaxy and overcoming challenges that would have been insurmountable for either species alone. The visions were so vivid, so real, that many of Zex's followers lowered their weapons, their faces filled with wonder. Even Zex himself seemed shaken, his hardened expression faltering. This is impossible, Zex whispered, his voice trembling. Carl took a step closer, his hand still extended. It's not only possible, Zex. It's happening right now. The choice is yours. Continue this path of destruction, or help us build this future. The tension in the atrium was palpable as everyone waited for Zex's response. The fate of two species hung in the balance, with the power to shape their shared destiny resting in the hands of those gathered in this moment of crisis.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.